In December 1938, a 60-year-old Jewish refugee sat in a snowy Swedish forest and calculated how to split the atom. She had no laboratory. She had no position. She had fled Germany 6 months earlier with 10 marks in her pocket and a diamond ring borrowed from Otto Hahn to bribe a border guard. The discovery she made on that walk through the pine trees outside Kungälv would eventually incinerate 2 cities. She would not be thanked for it. Ask anyone who discovered nuclear fission. They'll say Otto Hahn. They're wrong. Her name was Lise Meitner. And the story of what was taken from her is not simply the story of one woman and one prize. It is the story of how science erases the people it finds inconvenient, and how a system built on credit can strip a person bare while calling it circumstance. Meitner was born in Vienna in 1878, the third of 8 children in a secular Jewish family that believed, perhaps naively, in the power of education to overcome anything. Her father was a lawyer who paid for private tutoring when Austrian universities refused to admit women. She read Ludwig Boltzmann. She sat in his lectures at the University of Vienna and understood, at a level few students ever reached, that the physical world had rules, invisible, mathematical, absolute, and that those rules were worth a lifetime of attention. She was 28 when she arrived in Berlin to study under Max Planck. Planck initially told her she was wasting his time. He had, he said, never seen a woman succeed in physics. She stayed anyway. Within a year, Planck had changed his assessment entirely. By 1912, she was working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, the intellectual center of German physics, and she had formed a research partnership with a young chemist named Otto Hahn that would last 30 years. The partnership worked because they were complementary in the most precise sense. Hahn was a gifted experimental chemist, meticulous with physical materials, skilled at isolating radioactive substances and identifying their chemical properties. Meitner was the theorist. She understood the underlying physics of what the atoms were doing and why. Together, they discovered the element protactinium in 1917. Together, they spent the 1930s bombarding uranium with neutrons, trying to understand what happened inside the nucleus when you hit it hard enough. For most of that decade, nobody, including Meitner and Hahn, fully understood what they were seeing. The results were confusing. When neutrons struck uranium, the products didn't behave like slightly smaller versions of uranium. They behaved like entirely different elements. Barium, for instance, kept showing up. Nobody could explain it. The physics community was, in a sense, staring at the answer without the conceptual framework to read it. Then 1938 arrived, and Lise Meitner's world collapsed. Adolf Hitler had annexed Austria in March. The Nuremberg laws now applied to Austrian Jews. Meitner, who had been protected by her Austrian citizenship while working in Germany, was suddenly stateless and exposed. She had tried to leave earlier, through official channels, and been denied. The Nazi regime, by the summer of 1938, was actively blocking prominent Jewish scientists from emigrating. They didn't want their expertise leaving the country. Meitner's colleagues, including Hahn, worked in secret to extract her. On the 12th of July, 1938, she crossed into the Netherlands with a single small suitcase, an outdated passport, and that borrowed diamond ring. She left behind 30 years of notebooks, her instruments, her position, her pension, and everything she had built. She was 60 years old. She was starting over, in a country where she did not speak the language, with no official appointment, no salary, and no laboratory of her own. The Nobel laureate Niels Bohr arranged a small stipend through a Swedish research fund. She settled in Stockholm, and she kept working. Hahn continued the experiments in Berlin. They wrote letters. They had to be careful. Correspondence between a German scientist and a Jewish exile was not without risk in 1938, but the letters continued. Hahn sent her the results. In November, he wrote with something that genuinely baffled him. When they bombarded uranium, they were consistently getting barium. Barium has an atomic number of 56. Uranium is 92. You cannot simply knock a few protons off uranium and get barium. The gap is too large. Hahn wrote to her almost apologetically. The chemistry was incontrovertible, but the physics seemed impossible. He didn't understand it. He wasn't sure anyone did. He asked her to think about it. She was in Kungälv, west of Gothenburg, visiting her nephew Otto Robert Frisch for Christmas. Frisch was also a physicist, also a refugee. They walked in the snow and they talked. Maitner pulled out a scrap of paper and started doing calculations. She drew on an insight that had been sitting at the edge of nuclear physics for years, the liquid drop model of the nucleus, developed by Bohr and others, and she applied it to the uranium problem in a way nobody had before. The nucleus, she reasoned, was not rigid. It wobbled like a drop of liquid. If you hit it with a neutron, it could deform. And if the deformation exceeded a certain threshold, if the electrical repulsion between the protons overcame the nuclear force holding them together, the drop could split. Not chip, not shed a fragment. Split roughly in half into two entirely new nuclei with far lower atomic numbers. Barium made sense. Krypton made sense. And crucially, when you added up the masses of the products and compared them to the original uranium nucleus, there was a small discrepancy. Mass had been lost. Einstein's equation told you exactly where it went. Into energy. An enormous, almost unimaginable quantity of energy per atom. Lise Meitner had just explained nuclear fission. She and Frisch worked out the physics on that scrap of paper, in the snow, in December 1938. They even coined the term fission, borrowed from biology from the splitting of cells. Frisch returned to Copenhagen and confirmed it experimentally within weeks. Meitner drafted the theoretical framework. In February 1939, the paper was published in Nature, under the names Meitner and Frisch. Hahn and his colleague Fritz Strassmann had already published the experimental results in January. Their paper described what they found. Meitner and Frisch's paper explained what it meant. The discovery, in the fullest sense, the moment someone understood what was happening and why, belongs to the physics, and the physics belongs to Meitner. She made the theoretical leap. The experimental detection of fission products is not the same thing as understanding that fission is occurring. Without Meitner's explanation, Hahn had an anomalous result. With it, he had the most consequential discovery of the 20th century. Within months, physicists in the United States had understood the military implications. The Manhattan Project began. Meitner was invited to join it. She refused. She had already described her position. She wanted no part in building a bomb. She was, in this respect, consistent in a way that history rarely rewards. She remained in Stockholm. Hahn went on to international fame. In November 1944, the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry to Otto Hahn alone for the discovery of nuclear fission. Meitner's name was not mentioned. The citation credited Hahn with the discovery as though the theoretical explanation, the work that transformed a chemical curiosity into an understood physical phenomenon, had never been necessary. As though barium appearing in a uranium sample was self-evidently fission, rather than a mystery that required a refugee physicist working on a scrap of paper in a Swedish forest to decode. The Nobel Committee's internal deliberations were sealed for 50 years. When historians finally reviewed them, the picture they found was damning. Committee members had consulted with colleagues who, in some cases, had political or professional reasons to minimize Meitner's contribution. The prevailing view on the committee was that the chemistry was the discovery and the theory was secondary. This is a distinction that most physicists in 1944 would have found difficult to defend, and that most physicists today would find indefensible. It is worth being precise about what happened here because there is sometimes a temptation to assign this outcome to simple oversight or to neutral institutional forces. The evidence does not support that comfort. Meitner had been nominated for the Nobel Prize multiple times, both before and after the fission work, by Einstein, among others. Albert Einstein, who called her the German Marie Curie, nominated her. She was passed over each time. She was a woman. She was Jewish. She was in exile. None of these facts prevented the committee from knowing her name. All of them, in the specific historical moment of 1944, created conditions in which overlooking her was easier than honoring her. Hahn, for his part, did not correct the record in the way one might hope. He accepted the Nobel. He gave the lectures. He acknowledged Meitner's contributions in various places, over the years, in ways that consistently fell short of clarity. Whether this was deliberate, self-protective, or simply the product of a man who had genuinely reframed in his own mind the relative contributions, historians continue to debate. What is not debated is what the record shows. The prize went to him, the recognition went to him, and his name is the one that appears first in most casual histories of nuclear fission to this day. Meitner did not take this quietly, though she was rarely publicly bitter. She understood exactly what had happened. In a 1953 letter, she wrote that she had been treated as though she did not exist. In interviews late in her life, she was careful with her words but clear in her meaning. She had done the work. She knew she had done the work. She was not confused about it. The scientific community, to its credit, eventually corrected course, not fully and not quickly, but measurably. In 1966, Meitner, Hahn, and Strassman were jointly awarded the Enrico Fermi Award by the United States Atomic Energy Commission. It was the first time the award had gone to a non-American. Meitner received it in person. She was 87 years old. She died 2 years later in 1968, at 89, having never received a Nobel Prize. In 1997, element 109 was named meitnerium. It is a synthetic element, produced only in laboratories, existing for fractions of a second before it decays. It does not occur in nature. It has no industrial applications. It is, in every practical sense, a name attached to an absence, and yet, if you understand the history, the choice feels almost poetically apt. A gesture from the scientific community, sincere and belated, that acknowledges the debt without being able to repay it. There is no element named hahnium in current use. The name was proposed in the 1990s for element 105 and then withdrawn when naming conventions were revised. Meitnerium stands. Her notebooks survive. The letters between her and Hahn survive, archived in Berlin and in the Churchill Archives in Cambridge. The paper in Nature survives. The scrap calculations from that December walk do not, but Frisch's testimony about what happened in Kungälv, given multiple times over decades, is detailed and consistent. The evidence for the sequence of events is not in question among historians of science. The theoretical explanation of fission was Lise Meitner's. The term fission was Lise Meitner's. The framework that made the Manhattan Project comprehensible to the physicists who built the bomb was Lise Meitner's. She refused to join the project that used it. There is a particular quality to her story that makes it resistant to easy framing as triumph despite adversity, because the adversity did not resolve. She was not vindicated in her lifetime. The prizes she deserved did not come. What came instead was a long, productive, serious life in science. She kept publishing into her 80s, and a death quiet enough that the New York Times ran an obituary that misspelled her name. What her story offers is something harder than inspiration. It is a precise, documented case study in how institutions fail the people they are meant to honor. How the mechanisms of credit and recognition can be bent by the combined weight of gender and race and exile until someone who split the atom is a footnote in their own discovery. The atomic age began with calculations on a scrap of paper in a pine forest in Sweden by a refugee in the snow. That is not metaphor. That is the documented record. The woman who made those calculations died without a Nobel Prize, and the man who received hers died celebrated. Physics does not forget. The energy released when a nucleus splits follows Meitner's equations, whether her name appears in the textbook or not. The universe is not interested in the Nobel Committee's decisions. But we should be, because the question of who gets remembered, who gets credited, and who gets written out of their own work is not a historical curiosity. It is an active force, still operating, in every field where credit can be distributed and withheld. Lise Meitner's name is on an element that lasts milliseconds. Her work is in every nuclear reactor on Earth. Consider which of those two things more accurately measures what she gave the world, and consider how long it took anyone with the power to say so to say it out loud.